Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I'm just going to share my screen, so just bear with me 1 second. Good. Okay, so we're going to be talking this morning about the book collection that we plan to launch in the coming year. This is a book collection edited by myself, by Renato, Miguel, Carmo, who is with us today, and Annalisa, Murgia, who is also with us today. And we're joined by Agniezka Piasna, who is one of the contributors to the book, who's written a chapter on the platform economy, who's also going to speak a little bit about her contribution. Renato is from the University Institute of Lisbon. Annalisa is from currently Milan University, and Agniezka is from the European Trade Union Institute. I'm down in the programme as being a speaker from the University of Leicester. However, I should say that the University of Leicester is currently under a global academic boycott caused by the unions in Britain because of making a whole number of colleagues redundant, and further attacks on academic freedom and problems with governance and so on. So for the purposes of today's panel, please think about me as an independent researcher into work and employment, and incidentally, the joint chair of the union branch at my university, where we're currently fighting against redundancies. Let me say a few words about the book itself, and then I would like to spend 10 minutes or so presenting briefly my own chapter, and then I'll hand over to my co-presenters. So this is an outline of the chapters contained in the book. And I should say, first of all, that we have gone for a number of working titles, and this may well change again. But the one we've settled on for now is Faces of Precarity, Critical Perspectives on Work, Subjectivities and Struggles. We expect the finished book to be published by summer next year. So we'll have a manuscript going to press in a couple of months' time. Now, we should at least try to justify why we're producing yet another book on the theme of precarity, or indeed precariousness, because some of us and some of our contributors prefer to talk about precariousness to precarity, or see them as different terms with different meanings. The reason we've produced this is partly because it has become very clear to us that there continues to be an enormous upsurge in writing about precarity and precariousness, much of it focused on the question of subjectivity or on the worlds of work and employment. But there remains no clear consensus on what is meant by precarity or precariousness in this context. And what we try to do in this contribution is not to present a singular concept that we expect every author to adhere to, but to try to present before our audience the full range of views on precarity and precariousness in this context. And we've incorporated contributors who do this from across Europe. We made a conscious decision to constrain ourselves to using European authors and not trying to make this a collection that encompassed every view on precarity on a global scale. We felt it would be overly ambitious and a little bit presumptuous for the three of us editors, who are all based in Europe, to try to do that on a global scale. But we felt that we were well enough connected to different authors across Europe that we could at least present a European-wide set of perspectives on precarity and precariousness. As I say, without confining us to a single approach. So, as I say, the different authors have different perspectives in different chapters, but we all have something in common. And what I think we have in common is the criticality of our approaches. And when we talk about it being a critical collection, we mean that in both senses. Critical in the sense of questioning received wisdom and trying to offer a deeper theoretical insight and perspective that can gain understanding of precariousness and precarity. But secondly, critical of existing social conditions. So whatever our debates about the utility of the terms precarity and precariousness, we all acknowledge the deeply oppressive and exploitative nature of the contemporary world. And I think it's fair to say we all see ourselves as protagonists in attempts to transform the world for the better. The book is divided into 3 sections, not always neatly because there's a lot of overlap, of course, between the content of various chapters, as you would expect in a collection of this kind. But broadly speaking, we've tried to group the chapters together, as you can see on the slide. So the first section is a general section on sort of conceptualizations, subjectivities, and etymologies, looking at the various ways in which precarity and precariousness have been conceptualized and talked about in the literature. The second section, the longest section of the book, is focused on class, work, and employment. And there's a third section which contains some very important material, both concretizing these discussions of precarity, looking at specific groups that are facing precarity, including migrant workers, for example, and there's various other examples, but also focusing on the issues of struggle and trying to reintroduce the notion of agency among precarious workers in particular. In a moment, you'll hear a little bit more about some of the chapters from my 2 co-editors and Agniezka, who's written a chapter on precariousness in the platform economy. Before we do that, I'd like to speak briefly about my own chapter in the book, which is entitled The Problem with Precarity, Precarious Employment and Labour Markets. And the chapter is a sort of quite exploratory chapter, developing some of my own work, which is mainly focused on the UK economy and precarity and insecurity in this context, and trying to extend that work to look at various other economies and how precarious employment is experienced there, but also trying to make some general conclusions about how we should think about labour markets in this context. Now, why is precarity seen as a problem in this work? I think the first reason is that precarity has become a sort of buzzword that is used to an almost exponentially expanding degree in the academic research. I'm focused very much on English and the English-speaking world. Outside of academia, certainly in the English-speaking world, precarity is almost never used. Precariousness is, and I'll come back to that point in a second, but precarity is almost never used outside academia or academic-related areas. Within academia, it's used in such a huge variety of ways across a huge range of different academic disciplines that we are very, very far from any kind of consensus emerging about what we mean precisely by precarity. Indeed, I would say we are moving further away from any kind of consensus about what precarity means as it diffuses through different academic areas of research. And I think the responsibility of academics when we use specialized language is either we use it because it has specific scientific purchase on a problem. In other words, there's a consensus among thinkers and writers about what we actually understand by precarity, or it conforms to some sort of real world understanding of the concept. And here, as I say, I don't think precarity fulfills either of these objectives. Precariousness in a context of work and employment, I think, is much, much clearer, because lots of working class people will understand if you talk about precarious employment. But when you talk about precarious employment in this context, outside of academia, it generally means, to the people who use this terminology, jobs that are easily terminable, jobs that are short in duration, or jobs that are temporary. This seems to be in the English speaking world how the term precarious employment is used. In other words, contingent work. So what I do in my chapter, in my work more generally, is adopt a very narrow concept of precarious employment, quite different from other authors in other chapters, and try to look how this plays out in different labour forces. Now, the second problem with precarity is once you begin to look at precarious employment in this sense, you find that the patterns of contingent work are extraordinarily diverse. This is just some of the data I present in my chapter, looking at temporary employment as a percentage of total employment, and looking at job tenure. So how long do people, or how long have people been in their existing job? And I look at this for 5 different economies. In the end, I narrowed it down to 5. I initially looked at a few more than that. Now, when we talk about the diversity of experiences, if you look at the UK and the US, where a lot of this discourse about precarious employment takes place, one of the very striking things is if you look at temporary employment, and in the case of the UK, this is every worker who believes that their job is temporary in some way in surveys, you're talking about something like 1 in 16 workers. There isn't this massive expansion of temporary employment that you see in some economies, notably Italy and a little bit earlier in France. So, of course, there are lots of precarious workers in countries like Britain, lots of them. I know many of them. I've been involved in the struggles of many of them. I have been one of them myself. But these areas of precarious work seem to be hemmed in by areas of stability. And the stability is not always positive. We should talk alongside the scourge of precarity about a curse of stability, in which people stay in often unpleasant jobs of deteriorating quality for extraordinarily long periods of time. Indeed, the average worker in Britain can expect their job to last something like 16 years on average. So this is not necessarily a positive thing. Sometimes job mobility is a sign of workers' confidence and the vibrancy of labour markets, and sometimes stability is actually a form of stagnation. Moreover, another problem with precarious employment is that it's not actually a panacea for employers either. The aims of employers in this context are often quite contradictory. If you look at Britain at the moment, we're experiencing profound labour shortages in areas like haulage, low-paid service sector work in restaurants and bars and cafes. There's a profound problem in social care because of the level of staff turnover. And often you find, from the employer's perspective, a surprising, to some of us, desire to retain and hoard labour, which is something we have to weigh against the desire by employers to make workers more flexible and more precarious. And this is for very prosaic reasons about saving money from redundancy processes, retaining tacit knowledge, retaining skills, and so on. And this is a source of potential collective strength for workers, which poses questions about the often abject picture of labour that you get in much of the literature, where we're all just infinitely precarious now, and there's relatively little we can do to resist. If you look at other economies around Europe, though, you see this diversity of different patterns. But even here, it's a complicated picture. If you look at Italy, which epitomizes an economy in which temporary employment has been used to break up perceived rigidities in the labour market, Italy is also a country of extraordinary labour stagnation, in which job tenure is higher than pretty much anywhere else in Europe. So you have this coexistence of pools of temporary labour on the one hand, but also very, very long-term labour on the other. If you look at Germany, and I don't have time to go into the detail, but if you look at Japan and other countries, you get other trends which don't fit either of these patterns. And finally, because I'll run out of time if I try and say much more, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to argue that in order to explain these patterns, you can't have a simplistic notion of simply burgeoning, irresistible precarity. You have to identify the nuance, the contradictions in these pictures, and you have to develop a narrative that operates at multiple different levels. Often when people analyze labor markets, they fixate at either the level of individual firms or sectors, or they focus on the legislative environment, the institutional arrangements, and so on. And I want to argue that if we're serious about analysing labour markets in the plural as concrete objects which lead to particular outcomes, we have to have a more sophisticated approach to labour markets, which operates through multiple different levels of abstraction, starting at the most foundational level, at the firm level relationships between capital and labour, through which the labour process is constituted, moving through the market mechanisms through which labour power is bought and sold, rising through the processes of social reproduction that take place that allow both labour and capital to reproduce itself, through the broader institutional setting, including the state, and then reaching the levels of both oppression, which also permeate labour markets, but also the struggle and agency of workers themselves to transform their conditions. And what I try and do, and I only have time to describe what I do rather than offer any detail on this, is I try to offer an ordering of these different determinants based on the findings of critical political economy, and in particular Marxist political economy. And I argue that this is the best and most sophisticated way to analyze labour markets, to understand these processes of precarity and their complex contradictory nature. Okay, I will shut up there, and I'm going to hand over now to Annalisa Murgia, who's going to speak a little bit about her chapter and the way that she conceptualizes these different concepts.
Thanks a lot, Joseph. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, let me say that this is a collective work. So the chapter that we entitled Conceptualizing Precariousness, so we are one of the authors who prefer to use the concept of precariousness, and I'm going to explain why. So I wrote this work together with Emiliano Armano and Cristina Morini, who are two independent researchers. One is based in Turin, the other one is based in Milan. So I'll do my best to represent the three of us. So to introduce our chapter, so let's say that in this chapter we claim that within the vast body, I don't know why the slides, I cannot really, anyway, sorry. So what we claim in this chapter is that within the vast body of literature on precarization processes, two main lines of inquiry have informed the sociological approaches towards precarious work. So we define the first one as studies on precarity, which have been developed primarily in the field of economic sociology, and quoting Kallenberg and Ballas, have sought to identify the structural forces that have converged to erode the Fordist employment regime for a growing proportion of the workforce. So this first approach mainly focuses on the, let's say, objective conditions of contingent employment and on their consequences in terms of income and social protection. Then we named the second line of inquiry as studies on precariousness, which are instead more interested in a subjective experience that denotes a condition so extensive that it becomes a sort of existential precariousness, quoting Andrea Fumagalli, and which permeates individuals' entire lives. So the focus here is then on the effects that precarization has not only on labor, but also on life and subjectivity. So our contribution pays attention to the second body of literature with the aim of exploring the concept of precariousness, but also the ways of resisting it. Sorry. So let's say that in the theoretical approach that we use, precarious subjectivity does not only refer to the condition of temporary or discontinuous employment, but above all, to being subjectively placed in a situation in which one has to self-activate resources and to take sole responsibility both for one's choices and social protection. So starting from the results of a series of research projects carried out on this topic, mainly in Italy, by the three of us, our contribution addresses three main topics. So first, it defines the concept of precariousness and explores in terms of the production of subjectivity, introducing the concept of precarious enterprise worker. Then it offers a reflection on the digitalization processes during the pandemic, especially, and their effects on the production of subjectivity. And finally, it discusses the possibilities of both individual and collective action and the potential forms of resistance to precariousness. So our standing point is that the diffusion of precarization processes is basically one of the main characteristics of the current forms of subjectivation. And to better understand the differences between the concept of precarity, which we claim has been used in the global north mainly to identify the erosion of standard employment relations, from the concept of precariousness, which instead refers to the transformation of social relations in the direction of uncertainty. We can think about the work of Ulrich Beck but also Pierre Bourdieu. It is work, in our view, to make a distinction between the concept of condition and experience. Indeed, precariousness can not only be interpreted as the expression of a working condition, because it is also characterized by deep existential transformations that shape the experience of precarious lives. Moreover, we can only say that while condition is to a large extent determined from above, experience leads us to focus on the agency of the subjects and thus also on the way they can break away from a precarious condition. And this is even more meaningful than ever if we focus our attention on the relationship between precarious experience and the bodies of precarious workers. So within the wide debate on subjectivity, our position dialogues indeed with feminist approaches that have always considered subjectivity to be situated and incorporated in power relations and dominant discourses, and so felt the need to rethink subjectivity in terms that would allow for agency and for political action. So, focusing on the experience of precarious lives, as I was mentioning, we are interested in how subjects are called upon to make their own destiny and be entrepreneurs of themselves. quoting the pioneering work of Michel Foucault on that topic. In particular, we propose the concept of precarious workers and of precarious enterprise worker to analyze the hybrid set of situations which push the subjects to take on risk and invest totally in the production of their subjectivity. Boltanski and Chiapello, already at the end of the 90s, highlighted how in what they call the new spirit of capitalism, how the new spirit of capitalism is not based on obedience or control, but on the contrary, on the claims of self-determination and the needs for creativity expressed by workers. So in a certain sense, if you want, the subjects are captured in what could be called a sort of passion trap. Because on the one hand, they look for activities that are sources of passion and pleasure. But on the other hand, in this search, they experience passion in the most literary sense of the word, namely the pain and the suffering caused by the experience of precariousness. Therefore, we witness a phenomenon of capture, being entrapped by passions, emotions, and human relations which go beyond work relations. And this means that the forms of exploitation at work become even more intense than in the past, precisely because they are based on the single person's assumption of responsibility, on the conviction that we are the maker and also the cause of our success or failure. Mark Fisher talked about magical voluntarism to describe the conviction that we all have the power to become what we want, and if we don't succeed, it is our own personal failure. Sorry. So in this context, we also ask ourselves how digitalization, particularly in the era of the pandemic, affects precarious subjectivity. In particular, a new contradiction emerged in addition to the classical social and class inequalities concerning the gap between those who can afford to live and work in a protected way in a context mediated by digital technologies and those who simply cannot afford it. But also, if we look at those but also for those to whom the digitalization seemed to have offered the potential to free the cognitive and relational capacity by overcoming any physical limit, while interesting phenomena of competition and performativity have occurred, the philosopher Han Byung-Chul wrote visionary and prophetic words about the so-called digital presentism, and specifically his analysis highlight how the obsession of hyperactivity and the increasingly great tendency towards reactive multitasking actually ended up by producing depressive and neurotic disorders. So, coming to the last part of our contribution, we wonder how to counteract the belief in a false autonomy and in a sort of imagined freedom. We claim that we are dealing continuously with forms of introversion, sacrifice, unease, unhappiness, mainly moved by fear. But this paradigm of affliction and fear, this apotheosis of productivity and of the absence of pleasure, somehow can play in our favor. This is at least what we claim. And how does it do it? Well, in our view, by once again calling upon our bodies and politicizing what our body is able to say to us. The inspiration notably comes from Donna Haraway's situated knowledges, and the resulting assertion that knowledge is always partial because it's imperfect and because every point of view is always situated in time and space. And it's also partial in the sense that knowledge is never passive. So, quoting Donna Haraway, the point is to learn, to remember what we might have been otherwise, and might yet be as a matter of embodied fact. So if feminism made the body immediately political, bringing the person, sexuality, affections, and relationships directly back into our claims and political agendas, then the practice of starting from ourselves also comes to our aid in trying to investigate the subalternity to which what we define the precarious enterprise workers seems to be condemned. So the most fragile moments, those that the Keynesian welfare state was concerned with protecting, like childhood, sickness, old age, motherhood, are not a priority today. But we claim that the immersion in existential and generalized precariousness actually causes the body to emerge. That is, the most intimate, the most fragile, and the most exposed part emerges, linked to the different life phases, reproduction, and keeping existence alive. So the disruptive political practice of feminism came into being with a path of recognition based on the recovery of corporeality, sexuality, and materiality. Work riddance the lives that we live, and the lack of happiness and the construction of roles useful for power have a crucial effect on sexuality, on desire, and bodily and mental health. So in this context, the precarious enterprise workers is pushed to exclude the other, since the attention towards the other could represent an obstacle to the logic of perennial productivism. And the other could also be a dangerous antagonist, a more able, perhaps younger, perhaps more disciplined, compliant, and optimistic competitor. So in order to recognize these processes and to deconstruct the ways in which power determines forms of subjection, it therefore becomes crucial to return to the state of being embodied, and hence to recognize subjectivity in order to put a stop to the objectivation required by the dominant culture. And in looking back and forward at feminist thought, it is a matter of rereading and recognizing the knowledge embedded in the body in order to deconstruct the discourses of free choices, autonomy, entrepreneurship, to which the precarious enterprise workers is required to adhere. So to conclude, in our contribution, we asked ourselves how precarious subjectivities have transformed in the times of neoliberalism, and especially in the pandemic times. Taking a subject-oriented approach results in rethinking the very notion of precariousness. It is not something objective that depends exclusively on the lack of some typical forms of protection provided by wage employment, but the resulting polysemy of changing experiences and representations that take shape in relation to the drive towards self-entrepreneurship, to capturing the desires embedded in it, and to the experience of separation between body and mind, further exacerbated by the digital remoteness that happened during the pandemic for many of us. This means to also understand how a social action can be constructed that exits the logic of the individualization and enterprise. So in this contribution, we wanted to highlight some of the challenges to which the precarious enterprise worker is exposed. First of all, the need to acquire a sort of ethics and a culture of care in order to govern political relations and to imagine a project for a societies of care and bodies in order to repair the fundamental fabric of social relations. So rediscovering bodies, in our view, is already in itself a sort of political act of breakage, in conflict with what we can say is a male model of society, which is based on the commodification of the living world. And this rediscovery should also restore the revolutionary possibilities of desire, since the revolutionary opposition to capital is essentially an opposition of bodies, or to use Judith Butler's powerful words, an opposition of bodies in alliance. So I'm stopping here, and maybe then in the discussion we can continue our conversation.
Thank you, Annalisa, and well done for talking through a cold.
Sorry.
And I think you can all, no, it's great.
A bit paradoxically discussing about reclaiming bodies anyway.
Yeah. I think you can already see that even among the editors of the collection, we have quite different approaches, and that's something that we've chosen to celebrate, and adds to the richness of the collection. You know, we're coming from quite different angles, and I think there is a useful creative dialogue going on here. Our third speaker is going to be Agniezka, who's going to speak about her own contribution on the platform economy. So I'll hand over to you. Oh, Annalisa, do you want to stop sharing your screen as well, so that, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this excellent volume, and for the opportunity to share my thoughts and the messages of my chapter in this excellent event here. So what I contributed to the precariousness debate is the angle that platform economy allows us to take. And the contribution did not really center on describing the condition of platform work as being precarious. There were many empirical investigations already that showed very low earnings, high unpredictability, discrimination by or biases by algorithms. So what I mainly aimed at is to provide perhaps a more analytical dissection of drivers or dynamics of precariousness that are observable in the platform economy. And it is important, it is important even despite being a very small share of the labor market. So there are different estimates that would put it at really just a couple of percentage points of the labor force that is directly affected by labor conditions in the platform economy. But platform economy is not a new quality that emerged out of nowhere and it's distinct from the rest of the labor markets that we observe. It's part of the process of labor markets being more deregulated, flexibilized, workplaces being fissured, and more casual. Then on top of that, we have the technology that also was employed in traditional sectors with particular impacts on working conditions and on precariousness or outcomes for workers. So platform economy brings together many aspects of this flexibilization of work and technology use, and somehow it allows us to look for dynamics. So it brings in sharp focus dynamics that we can then apply or we can think them as applying to wider labor markets or spreading across different work environments. And we see, for instance, application of algorithmic management in a way that is applied in platforms across the retail or warehousing, logistics, care sector. So it is something that allows us to see in concentrated quality trends also observable across wider labor markets. And what I built my my short chapter around is the concept of shifting of risks. And the defining feature of platforms is that they organize labor markets or markets in a way that no one really assumes the role of the employer in that either triangular or more actor-based relationship. So there are platforms, there are workers providing labor, there are clients or requesters, so organizations who then purchase labor. There is this intermediary role of platforms. Sometimes there are also restaurants. So there are many actors involved, but really no one is employing anyone there. And platforms, they do intermediate labor, but are the most vocal about renouncing any of the responsibilities. So they would argue they are really just the tool, the internet, the digital platform that allows clients and workers to, or independent contractors and clients to connect. And this is visible in the use of terminology. So there are no pay slips in the platform economy. There are invoices. Everyone is a partner, or there are no workers really. And it was interesting to observe how platforms responded to COVID crisis, and some of the healthy measures they were required to implement. They were all, I mean, sitting here in Brussels at the European Trade Union Institute, I was also quite in touch with the narrative by platforms in the discussions of what they should provide to workers, and they were all quite skeptical whether they can provide anything, because then they would be held accountable for actually assuming the role of an employer in even to a slightest degree. So you can see that the market is really organized on the principle that there are self-employed and then some tools that connect them with clients. So what that produces is a self-employment related risk and uncertainty for providers of labor, so for workers. They do take the cost or risk involved in either falling demand, or when the equipment fails, or there's an accident or incapacity to work, they cover the cost. It is like in self-employment. So even, well, for instance, search for clients is also unpaid work. This resembles self-employment. So there, on one hand, the risk is shifted on those people, but there is no compensatory element. So the second leg of genuine self-employment, which is quite high level of autonomy. The way those markets operate and the way the technology that connects the size of the transaction works, it severely limits the scope for setting terms and conditions of work. So prices are not set by workers in most of the contexts. There is information asymmetry in a way that workers have to accept some assignments, not even knowing what is the price or the final remuneration they will receive. There is working time flexibility, but it's notional, and many studies already showed that the way algorithm allocates work really requires workers to be available for extended periods, to respond immediately, not to hesitate. So there are just a couple of seconds to respond. If there is longer break taken from work, for instance, holidays or sickness or any other reproduction-related leave, then the worker can be disconnected from the platform. So the work might discontinue at will, independently of workers. Well, the worker cannot really have any mechanism to then well, hold the platform accountable for what was done. So that creates a power asymmetry between work providers and platforms, or work buyers, the clients in this relationship. And it's this power asymmetry is not really just a subjective perception, although research, qualitative research into platform work provides striking assessments of workers. So I think Juliet Shore did some interviews in the US, and workers on platforms, they describe them as cannon fodder in this whole relationship in this labor process. In our investigation of the liberal riders here in Belgium, which is a country that provides some safety nets for them in any case, repeatedly we heard that it's modern slavery, this way of organizing work. So this very asymmetrical shifting of risks. And what I argue is that the efficiency gains or the cost reduction that the technology and the way that platforms organize labor markets allows is not really lowering costs in as much as it is shifting of those costs on labor providers. So that commodifies labor into a quite extreme form, and it's a purely market-based transaction. There is no feature of the standard employment or of regulated employment anymore, allowing, for instance, for some non-work times to also be remunerated. So why do people work there? And that's also quite an interesting argument that we hear from the side of employers, is that, well, if it was so bad, no one would take up work in the platform economy, which is, it is a silly argument when you are a sociologist, but in the policy debate, it is brought up quite often. And what platforms do offer is this flexibility or the entrepreneurship promise that Annalisa already talked about, so I will not go in more detail, and also the ease of joining the platform. So the access to the labor market is easy. But what it doesn't show is that the access to platform is easy, but access to paid work is not. So it moves the barrier of entry from entering the work relationship, so to say, to access to actual pay for work. Then it's much more difficult. It's also coupled with the strategy of over-hiring of workers, because they're not really hired, it's just the login on the platform. It's a pool of self-employed workers. It doesn't cost much to have thousands of them registered, as far as it's possible to encourage that many of them to be logged in on the platform. So that creates, again, the competition for work and the scarcity of resources that then push workers into following all the rules of platforms to get the paid employment. So extending their availability and responding to orders as platforms would expect them. So the last point I brought up is the consideration whether it is a precarious work or is it just precarious workers. And this reflection was also stimulated by so there are many features of platforms that tick all the boxes of precarious employment, but at the same time, some of the literature and definitely employers would argue they reduce precarity because the entry is easier for workers who are excluded from the labor market otherwise for different reasons. It can be personal life circumstances, can be related to disability, care obligations, migrant status, because it is difficult to then access regulated employment in a certain country, or being located in a geographical region with high unemployment and no job opportunities there. So it should integrate more people into paid work, but also it is a form of an extra income. So the argument quite often presented is that it might be low paid, but it's just extra money. So having the extra money allows you to pay off debt or make ends meet with otherwise too low hourly earnings. But then this really assigns the precariousness to a level of individual. And what I argue, this is the opposite of what job quality literature would have done. It doesn't matter who holds the job. It is the feature of the job that makes it precarious. So if the job is very low paid, it's below, it does not grant access to any labor rights protections or excludes from labor law and collective representation. These are the features of poor quality employment, of precarious employment. It's not that if a wealthy person holds this job, it makes the job better. So we should really concentrate on looking on what this job provides, because then it has spillover effects on different jobs within the traditional economy as well. And the effect is then much broader and much more difficult to contain. So it's also telling that, I think that's an important element of looking at platforms, that outcomes do differ by the characteristic of a worker. We cannot deny that, but then if anything, that just reproduces the inequalities that they were there already. So more wealthy people perhaps can access different kinds of platforms, those that are asset-based and not necessarily labor-based, than workers who have lower educational capital or social capital, or they have a migrant status that creates additional barriers to enter employment. So I think that's just sketching the main narratives developed in the chapter to really encourage you to, once it's out, to have a look and go through those debates, and also consider to what extent those developments are then applicable to different labor contexts. I think this is the main motivation to look at the platform economy, not to be anchored to the small segment of either food delivery riders or drivers, but really think more broadly, what can this bring to the wider world of work? Because it provides tools and infrastructure from the technical side, but also from the logic of organizing the labor exchange that can be applicable to wider contexts. And I think that's where we should be looking for the future investigations. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that. And just to encourage you, I noticed there's a couple of questions appeared in the Q&A tab. If you have questions you'd like to ask while we're speaking, then please put them up, or you can wait and I'll call you in a moment. Final speaker from us before I open us up to questions is Renato. So go ahead.
Hi, hello. Are you listening well? Okay, so I'm going to try to share my it's not a PowerPoint, it's a PDF, because the system is not working well. Just let's see, it's okay. Okay. So, are you seeing well? It's okay?
Yeah, we can see that.
It's okay? Okay. Okay. So, good morning. So I'm here to make a brief presentation of my chapter. This is a chapter that I written with a colleague of mine, which is Andrea Berata. So I'm a sociologist in Lisbon, working on the University Institute of Lisbon, sorry. And Andrea Berata is a philosopher, is working in the Universidade do Interior. It's difficult to translate this. And we have been working on this idea of time, so the concept of time. And I've been working on this, the notion of social time, and how we could relate social time with the phenomenon of precarity. I've been doing research during these last years, qualitative research mainly. We interview a lot of precarious workers. And one of the dimensions that we are looking at is this dimension of time, of social time. Not only the way people manage their daily life, but also the difficulties they have to project futures and make and create some time horizons. On the other hand, Andrea Berata is working in a more conceptual, in terms of a philosophical approach, the notion of time. So this was, I think, an interesting paper that you guys is a dialogue between not only two authors, but at the same time between philosophy and sociology. Of course, this is not. It's a relatively complex paper, so I'm not going to present all the parts of the paper. I'm going to present mainly the major ideas of our chapter. So, the first part of it basically is to analyze this notion of abstract time. So the idea is that with the contemporary living of time, it emerged a new conception of time since the late Middle Ages and during the Modernity. It's an abstract conception of time that is disentangled from the events, the social events, the personal events, and so on. So the idea is this: with the process of industrialization, of production, and the transformation of the very concept of labor into abstract labor, calculated in working hours, there's becoming a social relation measured by clock time. So of course, this is very well studied, very lot of research, is the emergence of the clock time. But the clock time turned out to be dominant in this process of the abstract conception of time. So the progressive centrality of the market and the industrial labor relation induced the passage from a relational conception of time, of social time, to an absolute, abstract, and non-relational conception measured time. In fact, I think this is also the process of commodification of work and labor. But it's interesting to look at this process of commodification through the process of time, of this looking of this structural change between a relational time to an abstract time, which is completely external and absolute. And this has produced a lot of changes into main aspects with a profound social impact, which is experienced particularly in job insecurity. So, on one hand, humans tend to live their own relation with time less and less as subjects with their own autonomy. So this idea of this abstract time, which becomes more completely dominant, it has an impact on our lives, and particular people that are in precarious, but I will look more deep in this. And one of these consequences is the loss of autonomy. And simultaneously, the people are more and more seen as an object of a transcendent and external time. And of course, the consequences is that subjects on time, it's increasingly, subjects' own time is increasingly vulnerable and important, while time that socially regulates their existence, for example, when you talk about economy, this is increasingly an importable continuity outside of the order of events. So this idea that we are, in fact, people are living without control their own time. This is the main question here. We don't control our own time, we as workers, but also we as, for instance, citizens and so on. So, and you propose this a notion, it's not a notion that we base in several, it's based in several authors, this idea of heteronomous time. This heteronomous time basically captured this idea that individuals lose control over their lived time and became subject to an uncontrollable increase of social uncertainty in their daily and personal lives. In fact, uncertainty is a very interesting and pertinent topic, and which relates with precarity. It's very clear that people, when we interview people that are in a precarious situations, one of the main complaints and the main difficulties is this idea that they are living in a permanent state of uncertainty, and this is very difficult to manage. It's a burden which is terrible for people's existence. So that's the second part of the paper. If we focus these dimensions, this transformation that time occurred during modernity, and the impact of precarity. So basically, the idea that precarity is a kind of vulnerable experience of time. So the asymmetrical relationship between a too powerful time of hyper-industrialized economic and technological systems, so the abstract time, and subjects with a temporality that is too powerless, so heteronomous time, is particularly notorious in the social condition of precariousness. in fact, we capture this dynamics through also two concepts, acceleration and fragmentation. I don't have time here to go further in this, but of course, we also established a dialogue between Atmur Rosa, which basically proposes a notion of social acceleration to study and to analyze the process of modernization, and also Byung-Chul An that look at fragmentation of time. And our thesis that acceleration and fragmentation, they basically feed each other. And through precarity or labor precarity, this is very notorious. So people basically are in a fragmentation process of labor. So the contracts are short-term contracts. They are moving from short-term contract to another short-term contract, or for internship for another internship, and so on and so on. And in the between, they could be unemployed. So this is idea of fragmentation of labor, which at the same time it's accelerated because basically they are moving is too fast. And at the same time, the tasks that people are basically doing are also in the process of continuous acceleration, of course, with internet and so on. So this is, of course, a very interesting topic. But the idea that people, in fact, are in this process of acceleration and fragmentation is so much powerful that basically they lose their self-determination and the individual autonomy. This is the main issue here. So the precarious individuals are deprived of the sovereignty of their own temporality, to the extent that they are subject to an external gear over which they do not have a slightest control. Precarity is a condition and a radicalized social expression of abstract, external, and standardized time that becomes dominant and unavoidable. So this idea for us that precarity, in fact, is a radicalization of these processes that basically are constituted by or through modernization. And precarity radicalized this experience of the domination of an abstract time that imposed to the rest and imposed to our lives and so on. And in fact, people are stuck to basically their condition of losing the autonomy to decide, to define a project, to in fact project future and so on. And this is very clear when we interview people in these conditions. They have so much difficulties to in fact define, for instance, some clues regarding the future. Most of them say that I don't have a clue what I'm going to do several months from here. I don't have projects. I have difficulty to project future. I don't have plans and so on. These kind of expressions are very usual, are very common when we interview these kind of people, people that are in precarious situations. This is terrible. When you talk about, for instance, the younger generations, we have conducted several studies regarding youth precariousness. And in fact, we interviewed several people, younger people, that in fact, they told us during the interviews that they don't have a clue what's going to be their life in the future. And this is very problematic. So I think, just to conclude, that and to connect to the theme and the topic of this global forum, that we need, in fact, a politics and a policy of time. And you have to think, of course, of democratization and decommodification. This is a very powerful demand and it's a powerful agenda. And I think it's also interesting to look at the time dimension. So democratization and decommodification are also politics of time. People and workers should have instruments, old or new instruments, to control their own time, not only in the labor, in the places, not only in the production relationships, but also in their own lives. And this, I think, this is our argument here and our contribution to this debate. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Renato, both speaking about time and very disciplined in your own timing,
Okay.
which is appreciated. We've got a little time now for people to contribute or to ask questions. I noticed that we have at least one of the chapter contributors, Valeria, here, and you'll be very welcome to say a few words. We have a couple of questions from Leah in the chat. I'll just read them out because they're short. The first is from a perspective of Germany. For example, social inequality and labour conditions related to age, the younger mainly affected from work flexibility and temporary employment. And the second one directed to me, asking whether statistics are useful, looking at relative averages of population in the context of temporary employment or other developments of the labour market, which it's a good point, which I'll come back to later on. Who else would like to add something in terms of questions or comments? Valeria, would you care to say a few words about your own contribution to the book, perhaps? Don't want to put you on the spot, but be very welcome to.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Nice to see all of you. Very nice. Also nice to see Annalisa as well. It's a long time. Well, yes, I mean, rather than perhaps saying a bit about my chapter, I wanted to link the narrative of the chapter with Glenn Morgan in this fantastic collection. To also a point which I was reflecting upon listening to all your very interesting presentation, and I was just thinking around the kind of issue which was also raised by Agniezka about these good jobs. Well, the kind of idea of good jobs. Now we see more and more that these good jobs are not there anymore. They are disappearing. For whatever kind of reasons. We see also that, in fact, we have, low wages, insecure employment conditions everywhere. So this idea of thinking that people, in fact, could have good jobs, perhaps, is disappearing on the one hand, and on the other hand, also thinking in terms of, our society being able to guarantee good jobs on the other hand is also a bit getting not so valuable in terms of argument anymore. So there is this kind of structural, I would say, element in thinking about this precarity. On the other hand, there is all the issue which also emerged from the presentation of Annalisa and also by Renato, looking at this lack of autonomy, lack of control, and particularly now looking at the work that Renato mentions of Rosa, I think it's quite interesting there to see that people, and this is perhaps what brings me thinking also about precarity from a more subjective perspective, or precariousness, in fact, as rightly mentioned by Annalisa, in terms of this uncertainty about the possibility that people might have to maintain their own status, which comes through this kind of really anxiety that people they have. So I was just wondering, and this comes very much also in the study we did with Glenn in our chapter, where we see very much that, in our narrative, we mentioned the fact that capitalism is really now more and more eating at the very core of our society in terms of our sociality as well. We, in our chapter, mentioned the fact that precarity, in fact, also recalling what Annalisa said before, is not just working conditions only, but is also, how this precarity in terms of uncertainty that people feature, how this affect the life of people, the family, the gender conditions. And we see this more and more, particularly looking at this aspect of unremunerated or unpaid labor, which emerge, in fact, in some context, like the gig economy is very prevalent, as also Agniezka mentioned before. So what I want to raise as a point here is whether, on the one hand, on the other, we could think about reconceptualizing or conceptualizing precarity or precariousness in terms of around, well, on the one hand, the struggle that people face and around which capitalism is today reconfiguring itself. And in that respect, trying to, combine the more structuralist approach with a more kind of subjective approach, because as I said before, good jobs, I don't want to sound too much pessimistic, but the kind of good job of the past, they are disappearing under the image of this entrepreneurship idea on the one hand, ideologically speaking. So they are not there anymore. There are structural conditions affecting, that. On the other hand, we see more and more that all these structural conditions affect very much also the way how people in their own private sphere, so the subjectivity as well. And in our chapter, for example, the family, the role of gender, the women, how this, has an impact also on people themselves. So I was wondering whether we could, perhaps would be fruitful to combine both aspects in looking at reconceptualizing, in fact, thinking about precarity and or precariousness.
Thanks for that, Valeria. It's lovely to have you here. And I think that's quite a broad question that we may all want to say a few words about in response. We also have another question, which I think is directed at Renato, which is from Natalie, which says, isn't it necessary to regard the question of politics of time interconnected not only with regard to planning life, but also about having a memory? So that's another question in the Q&A. A couple more minutes if anyone else wants to get in a quick question or a comment. I'll just give people a few seconds to respond. Yeah.
So, can we comment on this, or?
Yeah, I think because we're going to run out of time quite soon, so
Yeah.
let's have people come back on the questions and comments and so on. Should we do this in reverse order? So maybe Renato, if you want to go, do you want to go first, or go ahead.
Yeah, I can go first. Regarding the the comment of Valeria, in fact, in other paper, not with Andrea, but with other colleagues, we are basically trying to capture this how to capture this dimension that we talk about, the loss of autonomy and this idea that people basically struggle facing these new forms of exploitation and so on and so on. And we are basically look at this idea of the concept of ontological security. So the concept of ontological security was proposed by Giddens and other authors, and basically express this existential engagement in the search of relatively safe, stable, and intelligible situation within the social world. So people basically are sharing, they share rules and resources. They are capable to organize social relations in a routinized way. They basically trust in each other and institutions and so on. This is basically one of the pillars of modernity. So our idea is, in basically, can we talk about with these trends of precarization and the way they are go deeper in the existential dimension of life, if it's possible to talk about an ontological insecurity. Because for our ideas is, and in these latest studies that are developing, that workers' narratives reveal three temporal and social components related to precariousness. One is fragmentation, that I was talking about, that identifies the daily experience of labor segmentation manifested in the accumulation of non-permanent contracts, sometimes that are in very short periods of time, and so on and so on. The other is this idea of recursion or reversibility that reveals itself in the permanence of the labor precarious condition, despite of the stream rotation between jobs and different. And this is paradoxical because people, in fact, are moving from contract to contract, but at the same time, they have this feeling that they basically are in the same situation that is a precarious situation. They basically are paid and they have low salaries, low wages, their contracts are more or less the same. And so this idea that basically they are moving from work to work, but at the same time, their situation are basically the same. So this is very paradoxical. And uncertainty, is the three element here, which for us is a kind of a general environment in which previous dynamics, recursion, and fragmentation are anchored, with the experience of precarious be a dominant state. So my contribution here is not is to go deeper in this notion of, can we talk about an ontological insecurity? And this is very, very interesting to capture, I think, and it's a way of response from part of the challenges that Valeria puts us. Okay.
Thanks, Renato. And Agniezka, would you like to?
Oh, just sorry. The notion of memory. Memory. Yeah, of course. Memory is important because people in this kind of ontological insecurity is not a question also to don't have future or difficult to predict future, but this notion that the past is it's gone because people are basically in this idea that they are moved in the same situation. So like time were more or less the same. It's very strange, but it's very interesting to we don't have to explore this notion of memory, but I think it's a very interesting dimension to explore regarding this regarding precarity and precariousness. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Renato. Agniezka?
Yes, thank you. It was a very good point about good jobs being no longer there, and it is my impression that perhaps this nostalgia for past times is it's not shared by everyone, because even the standard employment relationship, which we might consider a gold standard, it didn't, well, not everyone had access to it, and it was based on the very idea that not everyone has access. So then there is a share of population that supports the main earner or a person in standard employment who is a fully fit adult in most cases. So it was discriminating along different lines, also based on characteristics of workers. It was not inclusive in a way that we might think of genuinely well, a good job or a good standard of a job. So the decline of standard employment as such is perhaps not a bad thing, and it happened along the changes that brought more people into the labor market, women, for instance, in the Western economies. So there was a work towards perhaps not well, dismantling or the decline, but how, I mean, the debate should be not about how to restore this share and its decline, but how to reformulate it or redefine it so that indeed it provides all with a possibility of having non-precarious employment and fulfilling a job that provides good working conditions. So I wouldn't perhaps say that in the past everything was perfect and now it's not, but we should look for ways to achieve labor market that fits the purpose of the society that wants to be inclusive and wants to be more open and offer equal chances to more people. And I think that's also, that links to the debate on what policy choices can there be, whether we want to go towards more of this market-based type of regulation. And I think the debate on non-work-based income support or income security, UBI is one example, but there are also other, whether this is a good direction. So the link of employment and social security or security for people in work, whether that's a good idea and how that actually should be achieved, so that we are not creating the platform economy across the board. And I think also the reasons why precarious employment, or at least gig economy, is so popular is because it addresses some of the limitations or constraints or barriers that were found in those good, so to say, or well, the regulated labor markets. And that's the difficulty to access them for many people, and also the difficulty of combining this work with other either obligations or particular conditions of a person. So perhaps if we focus on those areas and try to address them in the core labor market, it will be a fruitful direction, so that it wouldn't push people into precarious employment because it just allows them to access work in the first place. But yes, well, thank you for the debate. I think it's very needed, and especially now that new policy proposals perhaps might be tabled after the crisis, because the crisis, the COVID, the pandemic, that shifted the focus on obviously on emergency issues, but we should probably think about the long-term vision now that we emerge from the crisis, and see how that's changed the labor market and what we really need to apply at this moment so that it develops in a more sustainable way long-term.
Thank you for that. Annalisa?
Yes, thanks a lot for the discussion. We're starting from Valeria's comments on the different approaches we can adopt to study precarity and precariousness. I mean, of course, I agree that combining a more structural and a more subjective, let's say, approach is definitely promising. We also actually tried with Valeria to start by, following this line of inquiry. And it's also the idea to have very different contributions in this collection. So the idea is really to propose, to show different phases of precarity and precariousness. This is why we are thinking about this title. Well, concerning my personal research, I was always interested definitely more in, let's say, the precarious experiences. But now I'm working much more in trying to understand how the processes of precarization can be counteracted. Also because even the pandemic didn't change the dominant model of production and the dominant model of capitalism. So it's definitely the time to think about how to counteract this process, and definitely, focusing on the subjective level. First, I think it's crucial that we realize that what we perceive as a freedom, for instance, to manage our time, very often it translates in not having any sort of free time or the time to have a private life, the time to enjoy our life outside of our job, and to have future plans, as Renato was claiming, because not having the opportunity to plan our future is really destroying, also the hope that we can have in building a new model, a new life. So actually, well, the point is that how can we do it collectively? How can we do it as a researchers, as a citizens? I think that we are a bit responsible because we underestimated as a researchers the issue of precarity for many years. And I think that, and I'm very happy that that this is the first time we are discussing not only the book but also especially our point of views on the topic in this context, in the context of the Global Forum, because at least this is a first attempt to bring researchers, activists, citizens interested in thinking about a different future, bringing these people together. So I hope that this is a starting point before, acting in some way. We need to leave us the space to think about a different world. If you are not able to think about a different work, we can hardly practice a different world. So I just want to say that I'm very happy to be part of this Global Forum. And just let me say something about Natalie. She commented about young people, and I can only agree on the comment. I just want to point out that the situation is different in different countries, and of course the sort of disadvantages that we can see are different. Young people are a very relevant topic, but then the older generation is in trouble as well for many reasons, not to speak about gender issues. So yeah, we definitely need to find a way to keep everything together, because we cannot identify a single more important element. So I think that the challenge is precisely, to bring together all these different aspects. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. A few brief comments from me on the questions. On Valeria's point about good jobs, I agree with something Agniezka said. I think there's a quote from Brecht that we should take our cue not from the good old days, but the bad new ones. And I'm very skeptical about this notion that everything was rosy in the 1950s or 60s, because it wasn't true for lots of women in particular. It wasn't true for migrant workers. And it wasn't true for a lot of ordinary workers who were excluded from the kind of arrangements that people think of in this period. If you look at Britain, which has relatively high levels historically of trade union membership, for example, which is one of the signifiers of this standard relationship, trade union membership peaked at about 50% of the workforce in the early 1980s. There was really no period in this golden age in which most people were in a trade union or experience these kind of conditions. And we should be careful about looking with too rosy sort of spectacles at these earlier periods. I think it is true that there is a lot of problems with the world of work. I suppose my question is about whether these are best theorized through this singular concept of precarity. And one of the things I'm doing in my work is saying that there's a lot of different forms of suffering inside the working class, and some of them are not linked to what many ordinary people would understand about as precarious working. Often it's a person who says, I've been stuck in this horrible job for 15, 20 years, and I'm not sure I can get anything better. And for me, that's not necessarily precariousness in the way that I've conceptualized it. I think it is very interesting to look at things like job status insecurity, where people are worried about the loss of features of their job. And there's a really interesting academic discourse going back 20 or 30 years looking at this, but it didn't traditionally use the terminology of precarity. It talked about insecurity. And we should be a little bit humble as academics and theoreticians about saying we have this new concept and we're just going to assimilate all of this old research into this concept, and this new thing explains everything, because it's more complex and subtle than that. So I take the point about the loss of good jobs, and this is certainly a feature of the situation, but it takes many different forms, and we have to be a little bit humble about looking at previous research on this question. And of course, the situation in sub-Saharan Africa, where there was never, a standard employment relation in many countries, is radically different. And we also have to be a little bit careful about these kind of concepts. On the questions that were directed specifically to me, I just want to come back on the question of, is it useful to look at aggregates or average statistics across a labor force? There's two reasons why it is, and there's two reasons why it isn't, or why it has limitations. The reasons why it is useful. First of all, there are extraordinarily sweeping claims made about work and employment, and often these claims are overly simplistic, they're wrong, and they don't capture what's going on. And when I say to people, only 6% of people in Britain believe that their job is temporary in some ways, and on average their job is going to last 16 years, it doesn't fit with the conception that many people have in academia and elsewhere about what labour forces look like today. And so we have to be able to explain that. And so if there is this very counterintuitive picture that emerges from this data, it can indicate that we need a more complex and sophisticated way of grasping what's going on. The other good reason for looking at this is it can capture aggregate trends at a national level in terms of the institutional arrangements. Some of the better research on dualization of labour forces in recent years has operated at the sort of institutional level, looking at policy and how it can drive dualization or dedualization or liberalization or what have you. I think that only captures a part of what's going on, but it's an important element of the picture, and it is captured quite well in these statistics, but I don't think it goes far enough, and I am very skeptical about straightforward dualization approaches for reasons I talk about in the chapter. What are the limitations? The first limitation is it tells you very little about the lived experience and struggle of these people. And I'm very open in my own writing that there are better places to look if you want to know more about this. And some of our chapters deal with that much more effectively. But secondly, and much more significant from my perspective, one of the points I make is that these aggregate pictures don't capture everything about labour markets, because labour markets exist in the plural, and not all labour markets are the same. I'm an academic. I work in an academic labour market. The academic labour market, particularly in Britain, but also in other countries in Europe and elsewhere, is peculiar in the degree of precarious working. If you look at the statistics in Britain, it's off the charts compared to most areas of work in terms of the levels of temporary work, 0-hours contracts, people losing their jobs, short-term working, people moving between jobs. It's not the same as the labour market in manufacturing. It's not the same as the labour market in lumberjacks or firefighters or whatever section of the working class you want to look at. And we have to look concretely at the peculiarities of specific labour markets. And that's a point I make quite forcefully in my own chapter. Okay. That's all I want to say. So let me finish by thanking people for coming along to the session today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Global Forum on Democratizing Work. It's been a real delight to speak about our book. It's the first time we've really done this. The book is coming out, as I say, by summer next year from Bristol University Press. You will see on various mailing lists information about that book, I hope nearer the time, and I would hope that you buy it, and if you can't afford to buy it, get your local library or university library to buy it so that you can read it. And yeah, thank you all, and I'm sure people will get in touch if they have further questions or comments. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a nice day.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.